I want to start this review off by saying that I've never finished a Resident Evil game before. I played a few over at a friend's house back in the PS1 day, but I always found the controls to be a bit of a turnoff, so I never played one long enough to actually finish it. And since it's Halloween, we have Resident Evil 8 on the horizon. Now seems like a good chance for me to give the series another try. And since Resident Evil 4 seems to have a very good reputation online, I thought that'd be a good place for me to start. Resident Evil 4 picks up after the original trilogy. Umbrella Corporation has officially been disbanded, and Raccoon City has been neutralized, or really nuked. Leon Kennedy has been sent on a mission to rescue the president's daughter, who has been kidnapped and is being held captive in a rural village somewhere in Europe. Leon quickly realizes that this village is not a normal one when he finds that the villagers are all infected with some uncontrollable bloodlust, and they're all trying to kill him because, well, him, I guess. So rather than going up against zombies, this game has you going up against these villagers, who have all been infected with this parasite that completely takes over the host. So they're basically still kinda zombies. The game still uses the same tank controls as the original games on PS1, only instead of having a fixed camera angle, the camera is now positioned behind Leon's back and kinda over his shoulder. This new camera angle makes the tank controls much easier to grasp onto. This game has a much greater focus on action and storytelling than the previous games in the series, but since it still uses tank controls and there are a lot of horror elements, it still really feels like a Resident Evil game. Speaking of storytelling, I know that QuickTime events or QTEs usually get shit on by a lot of people, but I've always kind of enjoyed them. I'm definitely the sort of person who will pull up my phone during a long video game cutscene, and I feel like QuickTime events prevent me from doing that and keep me involved with the story. Despite the increase in action, this game still has a very spooky atmosphere, and it combines action with horror very well. You often hear the villagers chanting somewhere in the distance before you can see them, and it does a great job of putting you on the edge of your seat, because you know that they're out there, somewhere. And the parasites will often evolve into some really grotesque forms. Now, I've never really been much into horror, it's just never been my cup of tea. I prefer ginger tea. It's good for my tummy. But Resident Evil 4 was a game that was very easy for me to get into. While I may not care much for horror, I do love a well-made action game. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what this game is. A well-made action game that just happens to also have a lot of horror mixed in. There is a constant onslaught of enemies for you to fight through, and you do a ton more shooting than you do in the older games. And the pacing is also a lot faster than the older games, but still slower than a lot of other similar games. This slow pacing makes the close quarters combat really intense, because you have to carefully calculate every movement and make sure that every shot counts. This game also has some really good boss fights. Very few of them are simply shoot it till it dies, and most of them have some pretty involved strategies that only give you a very narrow window to do any real damage. I only recorded gameplay from the earlier parts of the game because I didn't want to risk accidentally showing any major spoilers, but the game actually has a lot more environments than what I'm showing here. There's the starting village, Salazar's castle, the research facility, and each one has a very gothic look to it, which further contributes to that horror atmosphere. And even though I always enjoy this type of action game, I'm usually not very good at them. According to the results screen at the end of my playthrough, I died almost 80 times while playing this. And even though it was much easier for me to grasp onto the tank controls, it still took some time for me to get used to it, and I wasted a lot of bullets in the earlier parts of the game. And even though the game does give you a lot of ammo to use, it doesn't really give you a lot to waste. So there were a few times where I straight up ran out of bullets. I think this game's reputation of being too easy because it's constantly throwing ammunition at you is seriously overblown. And even though I had a hard time with the game, I always felt like the difficulty was very fair. Any time that I died, I could tell it was my fault, and it usually didn't take much time for me to figure out what I was doing wrong. Plus, some of these death animations were funny enough that I really didn't care about getting killed at all. But the only part of the game that was actually difficult was the combat and trying to kill all the villagers. The environments are all very linear, and while there's still plenty of room for exploration, you're definitely being led down some very, very obvious hallways, and it's pretty hard to get lost. There are also a lot of very Zelda-esque puzzles that are all very easy to figure out. I think there was only one that I felt like I had to look it up. And then, of course, there are the escort mission sections. These sections where you have to safely guide Ashley from one place to the next is a huge part of the game, and it's something that a lot of people seem to have some very mixed opinions on. I actually kind of like these parts. I think that if the game was all just non-stop shooty bang bang action, it would eventually get stale and even boring. I think that these sections offer a nice variation to the gameplay, and as far as escort missions go, these aren't that bad. I don't remember any occasion where Ashley was just being a straight dumbass like a lot of escort missions will be, although there were a few times where I killed her on accident just because I wasn't being careful with my shooting. She also does a very good job of staying still and hiding when you tell her to do it, so she really doesn't get in the way all that often. For those that don't already know this, the original Devil May Cry actually began development as Resident Evil 4, before evolving into its own thing. And I've played that game a lot throughout my life, and now that I've finally gotten around to this one, I can see a lot of similarities between the two. Both games have very similar puzzles, and they both see the player have to go through a gothic castle. Both games have a femme fatale character with Trish in Devil May Cry and Ada in Resident Evil 4. And both games have a main protagonist whose main thing is that he's a badass. And then both games end with a timed mission where you have to escape the island before it's destroyed. But that doesn't make the gameplay of Resident Evil 4 any less impressive. This is easily some of the best from this period of gaming. But I sort of expected that going in because that's this game's reputation. But what I didn't expect was how much I enjoyed the game's story. Resident Evil 4's story isn't about people trying to save the world or even about characters trying to stop some sort of evil plan. The goal of the whole game is simply to get away. This has always been one of my favorite types of stories, ones where the characters are trying to escape the big bad rather than fight the big bad. The stakes are eventually raised as you learn that both Leon and Ashley have been infected with the parasite that is driving the villagers insane, and the big bad guy's big evil plan somehow involves Ashley turning into some sort of evil monster. Even though Leon is eventually forced to deal with both Sadler and the Los Plagos parasite, those are ultimately just more obstacles that are in the way of his true goal, which, like I said earlier, is just to escape with Ashley. I am so glad that I went outside of my comfort zone to play through this game. I had a blast going through it, and the story alone has me really wanting to play through the rest of the Resident Evil series. Maybe I'll review another one next Halloween. Thank you so much for watching my review of Resident Evil 4. I really hope you enjoyed it. Give the video a thumbs up if you did, and let me know about it in the comments down below. Next month I will be doing my list of the top 5 games of this console generation before the new one starts, so subscribe to the channel if you're not already to be sure you don't miss out on that. Follow me on Twitter, and I hope to see you next time.